Hi, everyone. My name is Isvari Mohan and I am here to do a workshop on how to write diverse thrillers. Huge thanks to Maddie for putting this together. Just an incredible week and incredible sessions all throughout the week that are hoping to help make you better writers or maybe just open your eyes to something new that you haven't necessarily seen before. So I'm really excited to be here. If you are watching and have questions, I would love to answer as many of them as I can. If you can please hold them to the end, I'll make sure to reserve time for questions. So I'm just going to jump right in and share my screen and talk a little bit about how to write diverse thrillers. My co-authors and I are always writing thrillers that are chock full of different types of diversity, both ones that we share and ones that we don't. So I just want to share a little bit more about how we write and how some of my friends write. I've actually spent the last year learning a lot more about how some of my diverse author friends look at the same topics and the same conversations, and where that's taken us as a community and sort of where trends are changing as well. So let me just share my screen. Okay, here we go. Okay, so how to write diverse thrillers. And a quick shout out to Dweebs Global, who helped me create this PowerPoint last year, and I updated it a bit and added a few things as well. So today I want to talk a little bit about just starting with what is diversity, what it is, how to decide on having it, how to research diverse topics, focus groups. You've probably all heard about focus groups and sensitivity readers, so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about both of those in some detail. I wanted to just do an overview of do's and don'ts. I think very often there are some obvious mistakes I see over and over again in different books, and then talk about some thriller-specific tips, since this is about diverse thrillers. And then I have a little bit of a bonus that I've put together this year. I just wanted to share a bit, like I mentioned, about industry trends and where it's all going from here. Okay, so first of all, a bit of a disclaimer. I'm one person, so even though I am myself diverse in a number of different ways, I have suffered mental health issues, I'm queer, I'm a brown woman, clearly, I still have a very specific perspective, right? Like I grew up in the US, I've spent time abroad, but I sometimes have an American bias, or maybe it's just I have a bias that combines all of those things I just said, being a queer brown woman, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I can speak for everyone or that I even speak for my own community, right? Everybody has a different opinion. So this is really not just from my opinions as someone who is a part of the community, but also as an author who has taken a lot of time to research how other people feel. And even then, I'm not necessarily correct about everything. So take everything with a pinch of salt. All right, so the first question is, what is diversity? This is a question that I feel like I get 10 different ways at my day job, as an author, as a reader. What counts as diversity? And it's a really good question. So here are some of the things that I think diversity is, that the industry thinks diversity is. So think about things that are protected by the law, right? Categories that are protected by the law, by employment commissions, things where if you read online, people are sensitive to the differences that people have. And even if they come from a different background, they allocate space for someone of a different background, right? So all the traditional things that you think diversity is: racial minorities, cultural minorities. So really quickly, right, there can be big differences between racial and cultural minorities, and sometimes they blur together, right? There can be people of exactly the same race who grew up in different countries and have different cultures, or maybe even grew up in different religions and have different cultures. And so highlighting those differences can be very important. For example, my co-authors and I wrote a book about another Indian woman. And in many ways, it was a self-insert for me, and I knew a lot and could identify a lot with her. But I come from a Hindu background, and she came from a Muslim background. And it's not just about the religious difference. It can also be about the cultural difference and about the foods you eat and where you grew up, that you want to get accurate when you portray them. Diversity is also immigrants and stories set outside the US and Western Europe. So sometimes people, a lot of stories, I would say the vast majority of stories we read in the English language are set in the US and Western Europe. So talking about immigration, especially talking about immigration where it isn't like a gritty immigrant story, but is about something more, and stories set outside in another country where you've explored or about the life and the land and everything can be a diverse story. Um, People with disabilities, people with different abilities, neurodivergence, queer people, people with different educational backgrounds, single mothers, dropouts, foster children, adoptees, more unique stories, right? So all these stories that aren't being told, that are being marginalized by traditional media, counts as meaningful diversity in your book. I also want to quickly touch about what diversity is not. So I see this, sadly, to this day in a number of books, including new releases. Diversity is not a person of color who is mentioned once as being a person of color and otherwise completely acts white. Now, here, let me explain what I mean by this because it's a bit controversial, right? It's not that people of color don't come from all different types of backgrounds and represent those backgrounds in different ways, right? And this is certainly not to diss minority authors who are writing about their own genuine experiences or who have a bunch of different diverse backgrounds, but feel that this is sort of a real experience that someone's had or someone's portrayed. This is specifically calling out white authors who retroactively, like, or at the end of the book, like, drop like a couple mentions that someone is a person of color, but they've otherwise written the voice and their circumstances and everything from their perspective as a white author. But then they wanted those sort of diversity points at the end. So they drop like, oh, by the way, this person is Black, this person is Indian, this person's Asian. I see it a lot with like Asian folk represented in sort of stories set in like New York or London, right? So that's something to avoid doing. Someone with a completely fictional disability. So I've seen this a lot too, where someone has a completely fictional disability. That's not to say you can't write a fictional disability. I've read some really great books that are fantasy or set in a magical setting, and they have some disability related to that magic. That's awesome, but I don't think it should be counted as necessarily meaningful diversity. And then an ensemble cast of all men or all white people, no matter how otherwise diverse they are, without good reason. So if you're writing a full ensemble cast, if they're 9 or 10 people, and for some reason they're all men or they're all white, right? Think to yourself, do I have to write the book this way? You definitely see a lot of books set historical fiction, like in Victorian England or maybe Germany, right, during World War II that are set like this. And I always ask you to challenge that because the truth is there were people of color back then. There were brown people, there were Asian people, there were Black people back then. They just aren't being represented. And is it actually the case that you want to write another book that has an entire ensemble cast that does not represent them? Women, so I asterisk this. Obviously, there are a lot of circumstances where women have faced discrimination in the past, but it's not really authentic and full diversity in today's world, right? There are gender minorities, and those absolutely are diversity and are books that we need to talk more about and write more about. Women themselves are not necessarily a minority where if you just have women, you can be like, that's the diversity. I understand that we are still underrepresented in a number of different genres, but in general, I don't think that counts. And then Republicans, we see this a lot these days. Insert Republicans with any like political minority that when they are not diverse in any other way, however, feels persecuted because they think the world is now embracing too much diversity, right? That's not diversity. And sadly, I have seen a lot of authors more and more, even over the past year, talk about how their book is diverse because it isn't liberal or it doesn't support diversity, or it's like, I'm writing the only anti-trans book out there that's obviously not diversity. That's just not great. Okay, so should I have diversity? This is a question that I think I got a lot last year when I was talking to a number of people about my experiences in the industry, and I was speaking to a lot of white authors. I think this has changed over the last year where people realize that it is really important for everyone to contribute to a diverse reading environment. But I do want to say, like, a resounding yes. It doesn't matter what your background is or whether you feel like you can speak authentically to a specific community. You should definitely have as much diversity as you feel you can have and do the work to make sure that it happens. First of all, your book will be better, right? Like, diverse books are just better. They're more interesting. You have all these different ways to give your characters interesting personalities and interesting appearances and just make it look like the real world. Your book will touch more people because obviously it's really important for a lot of us to see characters like us, for us to imagine people like us in our heads. It will be better for your career because in the long term, it's very difficult to just keep writing, right, the same books over and over again. It's good to stretch yourself. It's good to think about how can you write about people you may not personally identify with, but put yourself in their heads and their shoes and sort of grow your empathy muscle. Um, and most importantly, it's the right thing to do. So I wanted to touch a brief note on historical thrillers and authenticity, which is, relates a bit to what I was talking about in the last slide, with a lot of people thinking, hey, if Victorian England, and I want to talk about the upper class and they were all white, push yourself to think about whether that was true. And thrillers always have an element of fiction, an element of, more than realism, right? Especially in YA, the parents are always gone, and maybe there's less security than there actually was in real life. So if those are things that you think are acceptable limits on realism for the sake of the book, think about where you can insert diversity, and don't let, oh, it's not historically accurate, stop you. I think that happens very frequently, and it's often not even true, right? There have been people of color throughout all of history, and it also doesn't always make sense in a YA thriller, which is already a bit of a unrealistic genre. So a quick note on own voices. I've seen this whole debate go back and forth literally like 5 times over the past 3 years. People should only write own voices. People should not write own voices. They should, they shouldn't. So I'm going to share my perspectives on this, especially after talking to a number of minority writers over the past year. And that is, we are shifting away from the fact that you can only write identities that you represent yourself. One of the main reasons for this is because obviously you shouldn't force anyone to out themselves. If you're a queer person, you want to write a queer love story, you don't want to come out as queer yet publicly. It's a great, great reason to publish a book, but you may not be comfortable being own voices yet. There are many other reasons why I highly support people sort of talking about cultures and races that you may not necessarily belong to, right? One is ensemble casts. We've talked about them. You want to include people from different countries and cultures. If you don't have co-authors, that you may not be able to have someone from every single race or religious background or gender identity. You can write stories about different people, right? So touching back about quality books that touch on different lives, different stories. Minorities can never represent their own race and culture. So I want to focus on this point just a little bit. I think a lot of people think that the reason own voices was a good idea is because if I'm a brown woman, I can tell you all about being Indian. I can write about like whatever the stereotype is, like spicy food and like parents who are really stressing me out, and like all those stereotypes that I've been asked to write about by real agents, by real editors, because it's authentic when I say it. That's not true, right? I had a very specific immigrant experience in America. I know that my experiences are different from the average Indian, even. And there's no reason that my version is any more authentic than someone else writing about an experience that I did not have. Because even if it's own voice by the color of my skin or own voice by my culture or my gender, that doesn't mean that I have lived a more similar experience than someone else who may have grown up in the same community as another brown woman, eaten the same foods as that brown woman, like been their friend. They are probably better writing that perspective than I am. And so it's almost insulting to suggest that a minority can own voice represent their entire group. I will say, caveat this, and I do mention it again later, right? Like if the entire book is about the experience of being a minority, is about the experience of, say, coming out as trans or being queer or being Black in America, if that's the whole point of the book, then obviously that's a space you should probably leave for a writer who has that experience, because that's the point of the book, right? So, and I think most people get this now, right? What your comfort level is, what you're able to write. Don't fetishize or sort of, a minority group. Okay, so that was a bit of an introduction. I really wanted to dive into it. I wanted to share my thoughts on what diversity means, what I'm talking about today. People generally have an intuitive sense of it. Let's say you start writing a book. You're like, this is what I visualize the characters to be. Here's the story I want to write. How do you research, right? For accuracy purposes, how do you research? So, here are some of the ways that I have researched identities I don't share with, or even identities I share, in order to make sure that I'm doing an authentic job of representing a group or just doing an accurate job. And I do this for everything, right? So think about it as an educational experience, as a way for you to learn about a group you may not know about. And again, to practice that sort of empathy muscle. So one is articles about diversity written by the in-group. You can find a lot of these on Medium, sometimes on BuzzFeed, right? Those articles where it's like 10 things that it's like being an immigrant in America. Those are pretty accurate because they're written by people who experienced those things, and they are summarizing them in a succinct way to educate people outside the group. BuzzFeed also has some videos like that. There are other YouTube channels that do that. There's a lot of YouTubers who do comedy that are like in-group comedy. Those are always good to sort of learn a bit about the culture or the community you're writing about. Authentic stories or personal narratives. So this is actually potentially an even better source than an article, like an educational article or a creative article. This is literally like a lived experience, a literary article. Again, there's a lot of these on Medium. There are a few op-eds on like the Atlantic or the New York Times, but they all have a voice, right? And so now you're not only learning about their story, their experiences, how they grew up, what food they eat, but you're also learning about how they sound, what they speak like, if there are words they use, phrases they use, what they mean to that culture, if there's certain things that are offensive that would never happen. That's all very important. Medical journals, political articles, and other scientific research. You will notice that this is like my third point because I think a lot of people over rely on some research or statistic that was done by a predominantly white research organization that did not ask minorities how they feel about the research or did not control for things minorities would have thought were obvious to control for. So I caveat this, it's why it's third on the list. But if you are writing about a disease, for example, and you are writing about how it affects a brown or black person, remember that it affects brown or black people differently. It can often affect brown or black people differently than white people. If you're writing about a political situation and you are writing a diverse character, there was a book I read where they were writing about a black person living in New York City, and this was clearly pre all the education that has happened about police brutality in recent years, but definitely post where this author should have known about it. Completely glossed over that and did not touch on the impact of that to the black community. And it was something that if they had kept up to date with political articles, with current research, with the, sort of NYPD's, particularly bad sort of broken glass policing, they would have been aware of, and then maybe could have done more research about it, talked to someone about it, had a sensitivity reader focus on it, things like that. So it's a good way to just keep up with things. And then scientific research, I mentioned that one because obviously there are many ways in which being diverse has to do with a physical or mental disability or difference, right? And there's like different ability, and there's a difference between disability and differing abilities. And when you are writing about those things, it's good to keep up to date with where the medical research is and where science is, especially with medical articles that are about like, these are harmful things to say and do and talk about. And then, or these are like myths, and you can avoid further exacerbating that. Sessions like this, right? So if you want to talk to other authors, listen to them talk about it, right? Like I said, I'm just one viewpoint. There are probably things I'm saying today that other authors would strongly disagree with. And then friends. So I have this one rule for authentic diversity, which is do not write about a group you have no friends in. It won't be authentic at all. Again, do not write about a group you have no friends in. So if you are writing a book and you're like, I just wrote a character and I don't know anyone like this character in real life, whether it's race, religion, culture, disability, differing ability, queerness, transness, minority gender, someone from a country you've never visited, or even just someone who like has an experience that you're writing an electrician and you don't know any electricians, right? So not even related to diversity, but just in general. If you have no friends, if you know no one with that background, it's not going to be authentic. So ask yourself, do I care if it's authentic, right? Like maybe I don't care if this is a completely fictionalized version of being an electrician. But what you don't want to do with diversity is have a completely fictional version of what it means to be a minority, right? Because that can be very harmful in society. So if you don't have friends, get friends. In fact, it's probably a problem if there's this huge category of diverse minority and like, I don't know anybody in this category. That's scary. I actually recently looked at research that said the average white American does not have black friends, which to me just, right, that's horrible. So obviously make friends, right? Go out there, be a part of groups. You can join them online on Discord, other places if you may not be comfortable meeting new people in real life. But learn about people. And if you don't know anyone, then unfortunately, I do not think you should write about them because you will not, even in your mind's eye, you won't necessarily see them from an empathetic viewpoint or sort of know how to put your eyes in their body and look at the world through their lens. So that's like my one takeaway from today. It's that. Um, okay, so focus groups. Focus groups are, I think, one of the best ways to make sure you're getting authentic diversity as you write the book before you finish writing the book. And then after this, we'll talk about sensitivity readers. So, focus groups. People love talking to authors. So, literally, like, I have a friend who's an author, and he went out to the military base and was like, "Hey, I'm writing a story about war novels, and I want to know like how the plane works. Like, how noisy is it when you're flying? How would it feel like?" And they were like, "Sure, come fly in our military plane, and let's take you around, and you can like see all this cool stuff." People love talking to authors. You can get into places you would never typically be able to get into. So, talk to professionals in the field, talk to people in the minority group, such as people with a disability. And I'll mention why I specifically tagged that here. Experts in that minority identity, other authors working the area. You can create a Google form where you like politely and respectfully ask a bunch of questions like, "I'm here to learn. This is what I found out online. Obviously, do your research first. Here are the questions I still have. Would you mind answering these questions about your background?" And a really good place to find people to answer these questions, by the way, is Reddit communities and Discord communities. They're usually very, very happy to talk about the community they belong to, and their experiences with it. So I specifically tagged with a disability here because I think there are a lot of disabilities, especially invisible illnesses, where people have a very, very fictionalized idea of what it's actually like living with it. Um, I think this is because portrayal of people with disabilities in modern media and differing abilities in modern media is very wrong, right? And it's not even close to accurate, and very few people are trying to get it to be accurate. So, especially if you're writing about a disability, please, please, please talk to people who actually live with it and what their experiences actually are. What is it like going to doctors? What is it like living at home, going to work? What accommodations do they actually need? How soon do people actually notice, right? So make sure those things are accurate in your book. And then, yeah, let's talk about sensitivity readers. So I'm going to tell a story here that has nothing to do with diversity, but it's a great example of why you want people to read your book when it's done. So I read a book called The Appeal, and I don't mean to diss that specific book in particular or anything, but I'm bringing it up because if you're interested, it's a very, very popular book. It was recommended to me by several librarians. It's written in a very innovative style with a bunch of email exchanges and articles, and it's an adult legal thriller. Or it's actually, I guess, a psychological thriller more. And there are two things that book did really poorly that both could have been fixed by sensitivity readers and perhaps by focus groups, but especially by sensitivity readers. So the first, I feel like every attorney or lawyer I know who's read the book immediately talks about it, right? It is a very inaccurate portrayal of law firms. It's not how a law firm would work. It's not how a case like this would work. The court case is completely wrong. As an attorney myself, it kept taking me out of the book because I was like, this is completely fictional. I cannot take this seriously. This is not how a firm would work. Also, it portrayed mental illness very poorly. I basically invented some sort of fictional pseudo schizophrenia, which, by the way, happens very frequently in novels. And that was sort of one of the plot twists. And I'm going to stop there so I'm not like spoiling anything big. But that's also very harmful. And if they had had anyone in the field read it, like not just someone who's experienced it, but literally a psychologist read it, they probably would have said this is a very harmful way to portray these. And it's not just harmful, it's inaccurate, right? So even if you don't care for some reason about the harm you're doing, right, it's inaccurate. And you probably want a book that's as accurate as possible if you're writing a thriller that's more on the realistic side. So sensitivity readers, very, very important. They can be priceless. The role of a sensitivity read is to tell you what stereotypes to avoid, what things are inaccurate in your book, what unintentional racism, bias, and misrepresentations you have in your work, right? Sometimes, like for example, I did not know certain stereotypes about certain communities. So I may have written a book that involved a stereotype I did not know, but that fed into a harmful statement about someone else's culture, right? So when I was growing up, I didn't actually hear a lot of the racism that I learned when I was later. So I didn't know those stereotypes about what foods people eat or like what attitudes people had, right? So I didn't know, for example, that men are into sports and women who are into sports are like weird or something, right? I didn't grow up with that bias because my mom was really into sports and my dad was not. So I sort of thought vice versa. A lot of us do that. We grow up in cultures where we miss a stereotype or we miss something that's harmful because we grew up without sort of realizing that or opening our eyes to that. So sensitivity readers from the community can be like, hey, you said this, you may not have had any ill intent, but that's actually a stereotype. And having that in your book, it's going to make things worse. Sensitivity readers are professionals, not just people with the identity. And this is something that I really want to highlight because I think a lot of people are like, hey, my friend is Indian. Can you read this book? I wrote an Indian character. I'm not a professional sensitivity reader. I can read for like whether or not it feels accurate to me, but I can only speak to my very, very specific experience. A professional sensitivity reader has spent a lot of time researching this category that you're asking them to read for, not only for their own experience, but for more people with their experience. They know more about the identity that they're representing, that they're reading for. And so they can catch those things they may not have grown up with that are still problems. And if you can't afford one, right, then it's always good to ask your friends who may share that identity or who may know about that identity, and then wait until you get a formal editor or agent. But insist before it goes to publishing in a traditional publishing house. Sometimes they don't give you a sensitivity reader. Insist that you get one. You're like, hey, I did not know enough about the Black American experience. I do not know enough about the Jewish experience. I don't know enough about this specific disability. Even if you have it yourself, I want a sensitivity reader in this category. So push for that. And a final note here, ask about voice. It is very hard to get minority voice correct. You don't want to stereotype but you also don't want to whitewash, right? So this is sort of that balance I was talking about when I was talking about what diversity isn't. And I was like, don't just make a character diverse by skin color or religion at the very end. Right? That's whitewashing. But then also you don't want to stereotype. You don't want to be like, oh my God, this person only speaks in like another language and like every second word is some sort of ethnic reference, right? I've seen that happen. That's also not great, right? So ask about voice, ask the sensitivity reader, is this how someone from your community would speak about themselves, about other people? And one of the things that happens sadly in the industry today, to this day, I was hoping it would get better from last year. It has not. From the previous year, it's not. Minority voices are not weird. They don't all sound the same. They don't sound like a typical YA thriller. Like maybe you don't write like Carrie Maniscalco or something else because you're not from the same community. You're like, oh my gosh, an editor is getting back to me and saying like, this is basically Harry Potter, but it doesn't sound like Harry Potter and the voice is not syncing with me. Sometimes in the majority white editor community, a minority voice doesn't sound proper and they're going to ask you to edit that voice. They're going to say, hey, I think that, you know, I don't feel like that voice is accurate or like it doesn't fit the genre. Always let authentic minority voice trump optimal genre voice. Optimal genre voice is just what a bunch of bigwigs in publishing think is going to sell and pace right. And honestly, they're mostly white and it's what sounds right to them. It's often not what sounds right to us as people of color or people with disabilities or anything else, right? So ask about voice. Okay, so I know I've like thrown a lot of information out and I wanted to just focus on a few do's and don'ts so that I can like quickly go through some of the things that I have seen in literature and in the community that'll hopefully like stick with your brain in addition to all those sort of broad stuff I've been talking about. So here are some do's. Work against stereotypes. Okay, if you don't know anything else, and you don't have like you're gonna ignore other things, you don't have time, you don't have the money to pay a sensitivity reader, you're self-publishing, right? At the very least, work against stereotypes. So if you know that people are like Indian people eat a lot of spicy food and then work against that, right? Maybe don't have this be another book with an Indian kid whose parents are like, you can't date anyone and you eat a lot of spicy food, right? Like at least work against stereotypes. Don't harm a community more. Do portray people with disabilities as more than their disability. This is another really top tip. People with disabilities do not just serve as inspiration for abled folk, right? You can fully live your life with a disability. You can otherwise be quote unquote normal. You can register to people as normal. You can maybe even have an invisible illness, right? That should not be the entire point of the book, unless obviously you're a member, you have that disability. That's the point of the book. You're writing like a book that focuses on that disability and the experience. But if you're writing a thriller, we're talking about YA thrillers here. You can have a main character with a disability and they're doing everything that a normal thriller main character would do, and the disability is a part of them. It's not the entire thing. So huge point. Use subtlety, right? This shouldn't be like, I'm reminding you this person is Black. I'm reminding you this person is Muslim. I'm reminding you this person comes from a different country, right? It's subtle. It should be the same way we write about the default race, gender, class, religion, etc., right? There are no defaults in the world. Portray minority culture as normal, not weird. It relates to using subtlety, right? There's no default. It's not normal the way white families work or the way white food works, and then weird when minorities do it. One of the really nice things that I've been seeing a change in is, and I don't do this in my work as well, I don't italicize words in other languages or phrases in other languages that are very much a part of the vernacular of the English speaking local community, right? So, like, there are a lot of words I use that are Indian origin, but I just use them in my day-to-day life. I don't italicize them in the books I write because I wouldn't italicize them in real life, right? It's not me switching a language, it's part of my ordinary vernacular. Focus on stories about joy, right? So every minority story does not need to be about discrimination, pain, violence, grit, right? So it's a thriller, right? There's going to be scary parts. There are going to be parts that are, suboptimal. There are going to be so many things that aren't necessarily joyful in this book, but the fact that you are a minority is not always a source of discomfort or embarrassment or struggle. It can be a source of joy and pride and success. Use minority language, names, food, and mentions of skin color, different practices, right? So this is part of the whole, if you can go through your whole book and then go back and just insert skin color here, that's not authentic diversity, right? So as you're building it out, make sure that it's accurately portraying people's experiences and cultures. There's this trend lately with the Indian community where when we are portrayed by white cinema creators or book creators, our names, especially our first names, are always anglicized. That's actually very rare in the Indian community. It's much less common than in other Asian communities where, that's a much more common practice and it may make more authentic sense. But in the Indian community, it's actually pretty rare. So yes, once in a while there are anglicized names, but typically most of us actually do have names that follow sort of what they would have been back in India, right? And many times the reason that many Indians have names that sound more anglicized is actually because they are Christian. They come from specific states in India where that's common, right? So that's something I know because I grew up in that community. But if you don't know that, that's something you might want to learn and think about before you write a character. And I think there's this tendency to anglicize names or to at least make a name an easier version of what it may be or to pick an easy name. So don't do that if for only that reason. And then again, do leave stories focused entirely on being a minority to own voices. If your whole point of your story is, this is my experience with schizophrenia, this is my experience being autistic, this is my experience growing up as a Muslim in America, that should be left to someone who has those experiences. And if you don't, right, don't use slurs. Okay, sometimes there are books where a character uses slurs. They better be a really, really, really bad guy, and make sure you're not just doing it for shock value, right? Especially the N-word. Oh my God, there's so many people who just want to use the N-word somewhere. Don't do that. Just don't. Let characters, especially protagonists, get away with discrimination that never gets called out. Don't do that. I read a book by I think it was Anthony Horowitz, who's an author I actually really like, but he wrote this mystery series, and the main character, like the main detective, was, I think, basically homophobic, and he just kind of gets away with it, right? Like the character he's writing kind of called him out, but not really, and he's still the main character. And don't do that, right? Like if someone's a protagonist and your point is that they're good and your point is that they're not flawed in this way, then don't let them get away with discrimination, because you're basically, remember, we're writing YA books. You're writing books for the next generation and how we're shaping them. You don't want them to think this is something that's okay. Don't advocate for or glorify suicidal ideation, sexual assault, etc. I'm not even gonna give the books that do this the time of day to tell you their names, but I bet you've seen some of them. I don't know why. Don't do that. Make every minority story gritty. I talked about this, right? There's joy. Make minority stereotypes or extreme. Don't do that. Luckily, in YA books, I see a lot less of this. In adult books, I still see a number of military thrillers come out every year that's against the Muslim terrorists. Super, super horrible. Don't do that. I don't know why that still happens, why publishers are still publishing this. Don't do that. And don't whitewash. So I talked a little bit about that before, but also don't tokenize. So sometimes it can be very easy to have that one diverse character. And interestingly, as a diverse reader, I noticed that. So I sometimes read books like psychological thrillers or murder mysteries, and there's one diverse character. And from the get-go, I know they couldn't have done it because the industry standard, they're not going to let the one minority be the murderer. First of all, The reason I know that isn't because, wow, you did such a good job of diverse representation, and I know you're not going to make the one minority murdered. It's because you tokenized them, right? Like they're there so that you can prove that you're a diverse author and you care about this, and but if you're writing an authentic book, there should be enough diverse folk and there should be enough authentic diversity that you don't know what's going to happen because everyone's a person, right? Everyone's a fully fledged person. They're not just there representing a minority. Okay, thriller specific tips. I want to touch on this really quickly because I do think there are specific things that relate to the fact you're writing a thriller and perhaps even relate to the fact that you're writing a YA thriller because I think we have a higher standard of care here because we're writing towards teens, children. So, thriller tips. Remember that fears are different for different people. Ask people what they're scared of when you're talking about authenticity, when you talk to your friends who you may be writing about, when you read about a community, sensitivity readers, we talk to focus groups. What are people actually scared about? Sometimes you see people writing about disabilities where they're scared of something related to their disability that no one in the actual community would be afraid of. So, ask people about that. And not just that, by the way, just touching on that one, and with another point, sometimes people write about immigrant communities and they're not in the immigrant community and they have very weird ideas of what we're afraid of. So again, ask people. You're portraying the out there and the crazy, so the Overton window can be larger, but it's still YA, so be careful. So here's what I mean. You're writing a thriller, right? Things are going to be fictional. You're going to have to get the parents out of the way, usually, right, because it's YA. You're going to have a situation that's scarier probably than normal. You might even have elements that are paranormal or magical and that are just completely out of the bounds of reality. But it's still YA, so be careful about what you're representing about the real world. What metaphors are going to naturally be drawn by the average reader into the real world? And are you making a good point that you want the reader to take away? And you have more of an onus here because you're not writing an adult book. Sometimes I read really dark, disturbed adult books that do not have a good moral, but I'm an adult now. Don't let okay, please, this one thing. Just do not do this. I see this too much. Do not do this. I still see this in YA and adult. Do not do this. Mental illness, being trans, or being a minority religion is not a plot twist. It's not. Stop doing this. I cannot tell you how many psychological thrillers from the biggest authors, ones I still read, who are publishing today, adult YA, where the whole plot twist at the end is this person was actually like schizophrenic or fictional schizophrenic, by the way. This is not real schizophrenia. So is fictional schizophrenic or is suffering from fictional Munchausen's or fictional Munchausen's by proxy, or some other mental illness that is super inaccurately portrayed. Or the plot twist is, oh my God, that person was actually trans. Or this person is like in a community, but because they didn't wear a hijab, but they're actually Muslim. Why? This is not a plot twist. Somebody's identity is not a plot twist. Make sure you're portraying these things authentically. The whole plot twist should not be, oh my gosh, diversity. The only reason that diversity can even be seen as a plot twist in today's modern publishing culture is because it's so rare, it might as well be a plot twist. And that's just depressing. Don't do that. Okay, bad guys need to be bad, right? So if someone is doing is being racist or being sexist or, doing something horrible or like blurring the lines between consent, this is a big one. If you have a main character or a secondary character is blurring the lines with consent, with sex or anything else, right? They need to be bad. They need to be a bad guy, right? Even if they have some parts of them that are sympathetic, they still need to be bad. Don't condone that. Author's notes can be your friend. So if you wrote a book where some problematic things happened and you had to use, so I just reread Orphan Monster Spy, and Matt Killeen does this really great author's note where he talks about the things in the book why the decisions that he made. And a part of it is about the words and terminologies that were used back in the 1930s that aren't used today. And you can explain that in the author's note. And I think most readers read those. So you can add any nuance you weren't able to add for authenticity's sake in the thriller. And a special note on mental health portrayals. So just going back to that, right? Like portray things accurately. They shouldn't be a plot twist. And then on police procedural, spy shows, terrorism, and more, please do not play into the stereotype, right? So if you're writing a police procedural in today's world and the cops are just good and they're just doing their job and they are so not, supportive of minorities, like which planet are you living on? Especially if you're writing about American cops or the LAPD or the NYPD. Why? Don't do that. In fact, I honestly just don't think police procedurals are a thing people should necessarily write anymore. Unless you are Black in America, you're writing about the criminal justice system, like things like that. But from the perspective of a white cop, I don't know why we still write those. Spy shows, right? Spy shows about World War II or about World War One, great. Still, there usually are some, you want to make sure you're getting authentic diversity. Spy shows about the modern world where people are like sitting in another country in South America or the Middle East. They often have a lot of harmful stereotypes, so watch those. Terrorism, right? If you're writing about Muslim terrorism again for the millionth time, they ask yourself, is this going to feed into Islamophobia? Why am I writing this again? Is it honestly because this is an authentic experience, or because I think it's creating some like fear and I'm feeding off of the fear that exists in the white community against, Muslims? In which case, first of all, that's cheap. Create your own fear in the thriller. Don't rely on societal fear. And second, don't exacerbate societal fear of minorities. So I really want to quickly touch on examples, and I have a lot more of more good and bad examples to add, but I kind of wanted to touch a little bit on like a few examples that, stuck out to me. So you can sort of read the slide at your leisure and stuff. I want to highlight a few things. One is read questionable books. So sometimes books don't have perspectives that you agree with, or they may have diversity that you think is harmful, or that breaks some of the rules I said today so I don't like them, but other people do. Read those, right? Like, read them, see what other people wrote, see why they make you feel uncomfortable. Monday's Not Coming, I want to highlight too, because it's a book that's really good at diversity in one way and really bad at another way. It's really good at racial diversity and really bad at mental health. So, complex, listen to review groups, have sensitivity readers, touch on a bunch of different areas. And then I just wanted to mention, authors at these events, number 6 as well. So, Kayla Ingram wrote Darling, right? She was at this event last year. I mentioned Orphan Monster Spy right now. I actually only sort of picked up the book from the library last year because I knew the author from this event. So, read people at this event, because Maddie does a really good job of vetting who's here. And so our books are probably likelier to, be authentic, or at least we're trying our best, right? We'll probably still have mistakes, but we're at least trying. And then I sort of added this from last year. I added a few other things as well, but I actually added a whole slide on this because I spent the whole of last year sort of learning a lot more about the publishing industry and what's happening to it. So as many of you may know, the big 4 sort of became the big 3, right? There's fewer publishers now. The major houses have consolidated. There are fewer agents. There are fewer agents who have those inroads with them. A lot of editors have shuffled around. And you may have noticed that they are almost all white. So even though agents are getting more diverse over time, and you can find decent diverse agents, most of the editors are still white. There are very few non-white editors, and unfortunately, they face their own barriers in publishing because they're not white. They often have less power at the publishing houses, etc. And then even if you find diverse imprints, they're usually looking for specific stories. So I've seen a number of diverse imprints that are specifically looking for like immigrant stories about the immigrant experience, because that's what they think diversity means, or stories set in specific regions of Africa or Asia because other books have done well from there before, such as stories about the slums in India or magical realism in Nigeria that's sort of inspired by Children of Blood and Bone, right? So they're looking for other minority authors to basically act exactly like other minority authors, and that can be a challenge. You will also hear about diversity points if you are a minority author. I bet at some point we've all heard this in the industry, that your book can only have so much diversity because it's not sellable at some point, because you have to like create something that people are going to identify with. And that's really racist, right? We saw the pushback after like Turning Red, right? The Disney movie, Pixar movie, they released that, and a lot of reviewers were like, well, this is not relatable because it's about like periods and young Asian women and how many people are that. And people were like, yo, movies written about white men are equally specific. We're just all taught to identify with them. Sadly, this attitude is still really common, especially in publishing. Agents are pushing back on it. Some of the younger editors are pushing back on it, but it's still there, where basically if you have a main character who's diverse in one way, that's your diversity point. Now you can't have an interesting story structure, an interesting plot twist, or like more characters who are meaningfully diverse. So my co-authors and I first wrote a book where the main characters were diverse in many different ways. And then there was also a very innovative plot structure. So there was like religious diversity and as well as ethnic diversity, as well as like, cultural diversity, a lot of political conversations, and then sort of, other diversity, not to spoil anything. And then there was also like a major sort of plot twist or innovative way the book was written. And unfortunately, like basically after trying to shop it around for a year, our agent and we were like, we might need to publish a more commercial first book before we can find someone to pick this up. And so here are my tips that are like not they might not be the easiest things to hear. They may not be, I hope that you have a better experience than I've had and that some of my friends have had, but this is definitely what I've heard from a number of authors this year. We sort of had a conversation about this. We sat and talked about it. Some of the down and dirty, honest truths about starting a career as a diverse author writing diverse fiction, especially as a thriller. Write a commercial first book. Yes, it can take a lot of effort to write a book that you're not as passionate about, that doesn't talk about the diverse issues you really want to talk about. But especially if you're a minority author, it can be very valuable to just make sure your name gets out there. You write a commercial first book that can get picked up, and then you work with that publisher in the future. It's a recommendation that I've heard from agents and from publishers as well when they're off the record. So I'm just telling it to you on the record or whatever, because I want you to know the honest truth about what I've heard, as horrible as it is. Find an agent who cares about uplifting diversity. This is so, so big. If I did not have an agent I could vent about this to, I could share this with, I would like literally go crazy. So you can find one through hashtag DVPit, right? The Twitter diversity pitch. I don't know if it's sort of how I found an agent. I don't know if it's still taking place as many times a year, but it's a really great way to find agents who care. There are a lot of free edits for people of color. Dweebs Global offers them. We actually offer free edits for everyone. And then also Amanda Woody on Twitter offers a lot of edits for people of color. I know there's a number of agents. I think Susie Townsend even offers edits for minorities. I think it's usually people of color, but sometimes it's also people with disabilities or people with mental illness. I'm not quite sure, but I've definitely seen a lot for like Black people after, like, usually it's after something really bad happens, but they do offer those free edits, and so you can take advantage of them. And then obviously finding diverse agents who genuinely care and who genuinely represent the community is really great, and there are several of them, and it's growing. Consider international markets in self-publishing. So I have a friend who wasn't really able to break into the market in the United States, but found they could very successfully grow in like East Asia. And they did that, and they sold a lot of books. So, sometimes you can consider an international publisher or a market. That's something to potentially talk about with an agent, or even self-publish it if you know there's a community that really wants to read your book, and the traditional publishers are getting it all wrong. And they're like, nobody wants to read about immigrants or this person with a disability, but they're wrong. You can self-publish yourself, and you can even, I think Maddie's done this really well, like written anthologies, right, that represent authentic experiences of people who have a certain identity. And if the publishing industry isn't ready, then make it happen. And keep trying and don't give up, right? It is going to be 10 times harder for you than for a traditional like white male author writing a military thriller about something that's been written, very frequently. And that's the reality of the world, and it really sucks, but don't let it get you down, right? Keep trying, don't give up, find a community that's going to support you, that's trying to change things. Very, very worth it. So I'm going to switch to questions now. We just again wanted to thank Dweebs Global last year for creating these slides. And it's a free mentorship and free like mental health care org. So if you ever need help, you can go to contact and get it there. That's like my quick shout out. I work there. And I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm very, very happy to answer any questions if people have any. And yeah, go from there. Okay. So should we get sensitivity readers before querying a book? Great question. So if you can, yes, because the more sensitivity readers you get, the better your book will be. But for many of us, that's just a cost that we can't afford before we get a contract, and that's totally fine as well. As long as you've done a really good job of making sure as you go along that you've done the most authentic job that you can, you've talked to people, you maybe had a focus group, you've had beta readers who come from a bunch of diverse backgrounds and also are themselves or have friends who are in the community. Even if there are mistakes, right, an agent will know that they have time to get those corrected, and there's a sensitivity read, as long as there's nothing like glaringly wrong and there's nothing glaringly stereotypical or horrible about it. So yes, if you can, but they can be expensive, and I hate saying like there should be another barrier to getting published. So do your best. and then query. And one of the things I also think when querying is if you do get a sensitivity reader, that is something you can mention in the query. So that's something that when I had a relevant sensitivity reader, I mentioned in the query. So, like one of our books, although most of the diversity was something that we authentically could represent, there was like a Jewish MC, and I did get a sensitivity read for that. And so I mentioned that in the query letter. I don't know if it helped. My sense is probably not a lot, but it's something you can also mention. So I hope that sort of answered the question. Yes, if you can, but don't let it be a barrier. I never know how to incorporate skin tone into character descriptions, especially the MC. Good question. Great question. So I also just like sort of want to pause and like mention something that an author I really, really respect told me. Diverse author giving me advice as another diverse author on how to get published. She said, if you want to write a book that gets published and you don't want to like really highlight that you've written diverse characters, but you struggle to write white characters because you're writing like your authentic experience, just don't mention skin color. And most readers will default to thinking they're white. So then you can write a book and get it published and can be like your first commercial book. And you actually wrote them thinking of a minority in mind, but then you just didn't mention the skin color. People are going to think they're white. So sort of to answer your question, right, related to that, if you don't mention the skin color, a lot of readers are going to assume they're white, apparently, right? And when I think back at like books I used to read, I used to assume everyone was brown because I'm brown. And so like in my head, like my vague impression of skin color was always something between like medium to dark brown, right? Because that was like, I don't know what happened in my head. So I think that can sometimes happen. It can be a bias we have. So definitely if you're mentioning skin color, it should be something that you're mentioning for all your characters, not just your diverse characters. I often mention it subtly, right? Like if people are wearing clothes and I want to talk about how it offsets their skin, or when like, you know, in romantic scenes, if people are touching each other and you're talking about the color and texture of their skin. One of the things that I want to warn against is like a lot of people use like coffee or chocolate as like, don't do that because it's become a cliche and almost offensive, right? Like people's skin tones, comparing them to coffee or chocolate, specifically, don't do that. Um, but definitely mention it when you're mentioning like other aesthetic things like clothes, or someone romantic is interested in them. They're like their skin glowed in a certain way, or, you know, they're noticing their skin for other reasons. Or of course, if there's a scene centered on racism and then it comes up because someone is being racist about it, then obviously you can mention it as well. So yeah, great question. Yeah, great. So I think it is totally fine as a cis male to write a story about a woman. In fact, I wish more men did because we need more stories about women, and a lot of the biggest authors are cis male. So I don't think that there's any problem writing it from a woman's perspective. In fact, I actually have read a lot of sci-fi and mystery, even an adult lately, that's written by men but about a female main character. The reason people have warned you against this is because I think there's a lot of traditional male authors who write things like, um, she got up in the morning and stretched and her like boobs were really pretty, and like it was clearly written by a male gaze and not by a woman. But I don't actually see many male authors today do that, especially in YA. I think they're mostly good about it. So I don't think it's that much of a problem anymore. So definitely, if you want to write a perspective, write a story from a perspective of someone who's a woman or non-binary or anything else, it's generally fine. Again, if the whole point of the story though is that they're a woman or suffering from, if they are a person with a uterus and a woman and suffering from like a gynecological condition or specifically from patriarchy in society, if that's the whole point of the story, then that's probably better written by a female perspective. But honestly, in today's world, with women being 50% of the population ish on average, and a lot of cis men knowing a lot of women and experiencing a lot of that same patriarchy, I think that, this is totally fine. The warnings are about men who are like writing these very male gaze female characters, like focused on their sexuality or focused on like them using their sexuality to get ahead. So again, it's about fighting those stereotypes when you write. But I would not worry about writing a story from a woman's perspective. Yes, actually, let me like collect some of them and send them to you, because if I try to like shout them off the top of my head, I'm going to get them wrong. I basically just recovered from COVID and my brain fog's at 100. But I can definitely recommend websites or blogs to help with diverse writing tips. I recommend specifically checking like I think her last name is pronounced Phelan, Beth Phelan out, right? So she's the one who started DB Pitt, and I'm so sorry for after all her corrections on her last name, I still got it wrong. But she has a list, I believe, and then yes, thank you, Maddie. We'll put them in the video description. So and then I have to go look up because there was a like lit agents of color or something, which I found really helpful. That's actually where I started to look for agents specifically on. So yeah, that's really helpful as well. Oh, and then there's some great blogs written by sensitivity readers, and those you can usually just find by like Googling sensitivity readers, and their website usually has some initial information. And I found those very helpful when I couldn't afford to hire someone to actually read the whole book. Yes, entirely. If you have a character who's problematic views, include them, just call them out. Yes, that's exactly the right idea. I would say caution against really problematic views only for the purpose of dog whistling or racism, right? Because like even most racists do have nuance. So if you just portray them as a clear evil, sometimes it can take away from the scary nuance that actually exists in real life, where someone pretends they care about you and pretends they're doing a good job, but then they actually don't. So there's this really, really great skit that I think every author should watch. I'll put it in, I guess, the link as well in the video description. It's by Key and Peele, and it basically has this scene where they're at a bar and there's a whole bunch of well-meaning racists who come up to them and are like, oh my God, I really love you people. And like, this is the first time I've seen you people do blah, blah. And like, oh my God, Black people are so cool. And like all this like subtle racism you can't really fight or call out. It's like hard to know what to do. And at the end of it, the bartender is like, if it helps, I just hate Black people. And Key and Peele are like, you know what? I appreciate that because it's just racist and I can just fight it. And I've had that experience a lot as a minority in America where I'm like, oh my God, I wish you would just come out and say the things so I could call you out for it, but I can't do anything because you're being subtle about it. So I would say that with problematic views, if they're like racist or Islamophobic or like ableist, very often they're subtle. So they're not like openly problematic. So it can be hard to call them out. And that's okay too, as long as like the main character or the novel itself or basically the author voice is like calling it out in other ways. Like, hey, maybe that was problematic. Like that makes me feel uncomfortable. Like, am I uncomfortable about it? Why am I uncomfortable about it? So even if they're not directly called out, that's really important. So yeah, I would say call them out. Just don't include it just for dog whistling. And again, if with the N word specifically, I sometimes see it used just to like use it. Don't do that. And I hear there's one more question. So I had no idea you were typing these up. Huge shout out again to like Maddie who's running this, like just incredible superwoman. So kudos. Is it okay to invent races in fantasy? So yes, just make sure they don't track with like real races in a way that's problematic, right? So sometimes, often, people do this thing where they invent like darker skinned races who are like evil, right? Obviously, don't do that. But yeah, totally invent races in fantasy, right? Like sometimes, in fact, the less human like they are, the more freedom you have, right? So if they're like blue skinned or something and they are like don't have human features and they are just completely different, they live in the water and they live in the sky or something else, right? Like totally invent them. You can do whatever you want with them. Just be aware that whenever there's a racial division, and often in fantasy there's like war or conflict around those racial divisions, know that everyone is going to look at it as a metaphor for real life. So make sure that whatever metaphorical result that you have at the end is not problematic. So sometimes if you're inventing like a fantasy race and they have like at it clearly it's mirroring colonialism or it's mirroring a racial war, it's mirroring criminal justice issues in real life, make sure that the takeaways are not harmful. And so that's where I would bring in a sensitivity reader or even just a good editor to make sure that that's not an offensive portrayal or there's not like a way that metaphor could be taken, you know, sort of out of context. And one other thing is sometimes there are perspectives in fantasy. They're like words we use in fantasy that are actually real words in real life to certain races. So I would watch out for that too. And yes, you can definitely use non-human fantasy creatures to make a discourse on current racism. I actually thought Zootopia did a decent job of this. So I know it's like a controversial movie, but especially for its time, right? Because it was a while ago before some of the new conversations we've had on Twitter and you know, as society. And I thought it did a decent job. So definitely you can use non-human fantasy creatures to make a great discourse on current racism. Especially if you're a person of color yourself. Like I am really tempted to do this with our magical realism books, and I'd say go for it. So I think we're at time. So I'm so grateful and thankful to have been invited to this. I have done it now, I think, for a couple years. I am always happy to, because I just think this session is amazing, and also just seeing how it's grown. I'm so excited. So thank you so much, Maddie, for having me here. And check out all the other later panels today and all the other stuff on her website. And yeah, I'm really grateful for all your questions and for everyone who came to this. And if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to me or ask for help, and I'm happy to do it. So thank you all for coming, and go out there and write amazing thrillers.